What I'm about to tell you sounds like fiction, but every word is true. This is the story of a young woman who disappeared from a small Alabama town in 1992. Her family searched for her for 30 years. The police had suspects, they had theories, they had nothing concrete. And then, in 2021, a retired detective. Her name was April Marie Henderson. She was 23 years old when she vanished. Let me paint you a picture of who April really was, because she deserves to be remembered as more than just a victim. April grew up in Gadsden, Alabama. It's a small city in the northeastern part of the state.
April was beautiful. 5'4", with long auburn hair that fell past her shoulders, green eyes that her mother said could light up a room. She had a smile that was contagious, the kind of person who laughed easily and often. She had a small scar above her right eyebrow from a bicycle accident when she was 7, a dimple on her left cheek, freckles across her nose that got darker in summer. She worked at the Goodyear tire plant in Gadsden. It wasn't glamorous work, but April didn't mind. April lived in a small one-bedroom apartment on Chestnut Street, right off the main downtown area. It was modest, but cozy. She decorated it herself with thrift store finds and plants she was constantly trying to keep alive. Her best friend, Jessica, said April had a black thumb but refused to give up on her plants. That was April, stubborn in the best way, determined, hopeful. She was close with her family. Her mother, Linda, worked.
April had dreams. She wanted to go back to school. She'd taken some classes at Gadsden State Community College, but had to drop out when money got tight. She'd talked about becoming a teacher. She loved kids. She volunteered at the Boys and Girls Club on Saturday mornings, helping elementary school kids with reading. She had this gift for making learning fun, for making shy kids feel confident. She was dating someone. April had dreams. She wanted to go back to school. She'd taken some classes at Gadsden State Community College, but had to drop out when money got tight. She'd talked about becoming a teacher. She loved kids. She volunteered at the Boys and Girls Club on Saturday mornings, helping elementary school kids with reading. She had this gift for making learning fun, for making shy kids feel confident. She was dating someone. His name was Travis Cunningham. They'd been together for about 8 months. Travis was April had this quirky habit of collecting snow globes. I know that sounds random, but it tells you something about her. She'd never seen real snow. Born and raised in Alabama, she'd never been north of Tennessee, but she loved the idea of snow, the romance of it. She had maybe 20 snow globes in her apartment, different cities, different scenes. Her favorite was one from New York City with the Statue of Liberty inside. Travis had given it to her for her birthday. She loved music.
April was the kind of person who made everyone feel special. She remembered details. She listened. She cared. When her coworker's mother died, April organized a meal train that lasted 2 weeks. When Jessica went through a bad breakup, April showed up at her door at 11 at night with ice cream and tissues and stayed until dawn. She wasn't perfect. Nobody is. She could be stubborn. She held grudges sometimes.
She had a temper when pushed too far. She smoked cigarettes even though her mother begged her to quit. She stayed up too late watching television. Use a calm, mid-aged male narrator voice with a deep, resonant tone, rich in gravity and suspense. Speak with the authority of an experienced storyteller, as if revealing long-hidden truths in a true crime documentary. Maintain steady, deliberate pacing, no rushing, no unnecessary pauses. Keep rhythm consistent from start to finish, ensuring the narration ends at the exact same moment as the video. Slight tension in the voice is acceptable, but avoid exaggeration. The tone should feel realistic, serious, and hauntingly cinematic. Adjust speaking rate dynamically to stay perfectly aligned with visuals and emotional beats. Maintain clarity and warmth while preserving the mysterious undertone. Let the voice carry subtle weight, as if each word uncovers a deeper layer of the story. Let me take you back to Gadsden, Alabama, in 1992. Picture a city of about 40,000. April's apartment was in an older building, probably built in the 1960s. 3 stories, red brick with exterior staircases. Her apartment was on the 2nd floor, number 207. The building had maybe 20 units total, mostly young people, some older folks on fixed incomes. The kind of place where you knew your neighbors but weren't necessarily friends with them. Chestnut Street was quiet, residential. This was 1992, remember. No cell phones, no internet, no Ring doorbells or security cameras everywhere. If you wanted to call someone, you used a landline or a payphone. If you wanted to know something, you looked it up in an encyclopedia or asked someone who might know. Privacy was easier. So was disappearing. The political climate was tense that winter. The nation was gearing up for a presidential election. The economy. People in Gadsden were friendly. Southern hospitality wasn't just a saying, it was a way of life. You waved at people you passed on the street. You held doors open. You brought casseroles to new neighbors. But beneath that friendliness was something else, an insularity, a tendency to protect your own, a reluctance to believe that evil could exist in your community. April's building didn't have much security. The front door locked, but residents often propped it open. There was no doorman, no cameras, no alarm system. Anyone could walk in if they wanted to. February 14th, 1992. Valentine's Day. April had plans with Travis. Nothing fancy. They were going to have dinner at his place, maybe watch a movie, just spend time together. April left work at 5:30 that evening. Her co-worker Michelle saw her walk to her truck in the parking lot. April waved goodbye. She seemed happy, normal. April drove home to her apartment. This we know because her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, saw April arrive around 6 o'clock. Mrs. Patterson was taking out her trash. She and April exchanged pleasantries, talked about the weather. April mentioned she was going to her boyfriend's place for dinner. Mrs. Patterson said April seemed cheerful, excited even. April went into her apartment. According to what investigators would later piece together, she planned to shower and change clothes before driving to Travis's house. Travis lived about 15 minutes away, in a rental house on the outskirts of Gadsden. Travis was expecting April around 7:30. He'd made spaghetti, set the table. He'd bought her flowers, red roses. He was nervous because he'd planned to give her a promise ring. Not an engagement ring, but something to show he was serious about their future. 7:30 came and went. No April. Travis wasn't immediately worried. He figured she was running late. Women take forever to get ready, he thought. He called her apartment. No answer. This was before answering machines were common, so the phone just rang and rang. 8 o'clock. Still no April. Travis called again. Still no answer. Now he was starting to worry. It wasn't like April to be this late without calling. She was considerate, punctual usually. 8:30. Travis decided to drive to April's apartment. Something felt wrong. He couldn't explain it, just a feeling in his gut. He arrived at her building around 8:45. Her truck was parked on the street right in front. That made him feel better at first. She was home. Maybe she'd fallen asleep. Maybe she wasn't feeling well. He went up to her apartment, knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked louder, called her name. Nothing. He tried the doorknob. Locked. Travis went back to his truck and called April's parents from a payphone down the street. Linda answered. Travis explained the situation. Linda immediately felt something was wrong, a mother's intuition. She and Robert drove to April's apartment right away. They arrived around 9:15. The three of them stood outside April's door, knocking, calling her name. Linda had a key. April had given her one months ago, just in case. She used it to unlock the door. They walked into the apartment. The lights were on in the living room. The television was on, volume low. April's purse was on the coffee table, her keys next to it. Her wallet was in her purse, cash and cards still inside. Her coat was draped over the couch. They checked every room, bedroom, bathroom, kitchen. April wasn't there. Her bed was made. The bathroom showed signs she'd been there recently. Damp towel on the rack, hairdryer plugged in, makeup scattered on the counter, like she'd started getting ready, and then stopped. They checked her closet. Her clothes were there. They checked the bathroom again. Her toothbrush was there. Her contact lens case was on the sink. April wore contacts. She was practically blind without them, or her glasses. Her glasses were on the nightstand next to her bed. This is important. April wouldn't have left voluntarily without her contacts or glasses. She couldn't see without them. She wouldn't have left her apartment unlocked with the television on. Robert called the police at 9:37. The Gadsden Police Department dispatched an officer immediately. Officer Danny Martinez arrived at 9:52. He took statements from Travis, Linda, and Robert. He walked through the apartment. He noted that there were no signs of struggle, no broken furniture, no blood, no obvious evidence of a crime. But there were strange details. The back door to April's apartment, which led to a small balcony, was unlocked. April always kept it locked. Always. She was paranoid about someone breaking in. The deadbolt was undone. The chain wasn't on. On the kitchen counter was a half-eaten sandwich, turkey and cheese. One bite taken, like she'd made herself food and then been interrupted. Her cigarettes were on the coffee table next to an ashtray with one freshly stubbed-out cigarette. The TV was tuned to the local news. The gift bag with Travis's present was sitting by the door, like she'd set it there to remember to take it with her. Officer Martinez asked if April had any enemies, anyone who might want to hurt her. Travis, Linda, and Robert all said no. April was loved by everyone. She didn't have enemies. She didn't owe money. She didn't use drugs. She wasn't involved in anything dangerous. Martinez asked if April might have run away, left on her own. Linda firmly said no. April wouldn't do that. She had no reason to. She was happy. She was planning her future.
But Martinez had to consider all possibilities. Young women sometimes left their lives behind. Relationships, families, responsibilities. It happened. Maybe April got cold feet about the relationship. Maybe she needed space. Maybe there was something going on no one knew about. Travis was questioned more extensively. The boyfriend is always the first suspect. Where was he? Could he prove it? Travis explained he'd been home all evening waiting for April. He'd made dinner. He lived alone, so no one could corroborate his story until he called April's parents. But he seemed genuinely distraught, desperate, confused. The police began a search of the building and surrounding area that night. They knocked on every door in April's building. Had anyone seen her, heard anything unusual, seen anyone suspicious? Mrs. Patterson repeated what she'd told police earlier. She'd seen April arrive home around 6, talked to her briefly, hadn't seen or heard anything after that. Her apartment was right below April's. She said she hadn't heard any screams, any sounds of struggle, anything unusual at all. She'd been watching television all evening.
A man in Unit 209, directly next to April's, was named David Marsh. He was 42 years old, worked nights at a warehouse. He said he'd been home until about 7:15 when he left for work. He hadn't seen April that evening, hadn't heard anything unusual. He seemed cooperative, a little annoyed at being questioned, but cooperative. No one else had seen or heard anything helpful. It was like April had vanished into thin air. By midnight, the police had expanded the search. Officers walked the streets with flashlights, checked dumpsters, looked in parked cars, searched the wooded area behind the apartment building. Nothing. No trace of April. The first 24 hours are critical in a missing person case. Everyone knows that. But in 1992, the response wasn't as immediate as it would be today. Adults were often considered to have left voluntarily unless there was clear evidence of foul play. The police searched, yes, but they also waited, hoping April would come home on her own, hoping there was a simple explanation.
Linda and Robert refused to leave April's apartment. They sat on her couch, surrounded by her things, waiting, praying. The phone rang twice during the night. Both times they jumped to answer. Both times it was friends calling after hearing the news. Not April. Travis stayed too. He blamed himself. If only he'd driven to her apartment earlier. If only he'd insisted on picking her up instead of having her drive to him. If only, if only, if only. The sun rose on February 15th. April had been missing for approximately 12 hours. She was somewhere. But where? And more terrifyingly, with whom?
Detective James Crawford caught the case. He was a 20-year veteran of the Gadsden Police Department, a good detective, thorough, patient. He'd worked homicides, robberies, assaults, but missing persons were different. Time was the enemy. Every hour that passed decreased the chances of finding April alive. Crawford arrived at April's apartment at 7:30 on the morning of February 15th. He walked through the scene again, slowly, carefully, looking for anything the responding officers might have missed. He photographed everything: the layout of the apartment, the purse on the coffee table, the cigarette in the ashtray, the half-eaten sandwich, the unlocked back door, the damp towel, the made bed. Every detail mattered.
He dusted for fingerprints. He found April's prints everywhere, as expected. He found prints belonging to Travis, Linda, Robert, and Jessica, all people who had legitimate reasons to be in the apartment. He found a few unidentified prints on the back doorknob, but prints alone weren't enough. They could belong to anyone: a maintenance worker, a previous tenant, a friend. Crawford interviewed everyone in the building again, this time more thoroughly. He asked about April's routine, her habits, her visitors. Had anyone noticed any strangers in the building recently? Any maintenance workers or delivery people who seemed suspicious? Mrs. Patterson was helpful, but had little new information. She liked April, thought she was a sweet girl. She'd never seen any problems, never heard fights from April's apartment, never noticed anyone suspicious hanging around.
David Marsh, the neighbor in 209, was interviewed again. Crawford noted that Marsh seemed nervous, fidgety, but Marsh explained he'd had a tough night at work. He'd only gotten a few hours of sleep before police woke him with questions. Crawford asked permission to look around Marsh's apartment. Marsh hesitated, but agreed. Marsh's apartment was messy, lived in, dishes in the sink, clothes on the floor, typical bachelor pad, nothing immediately suspicious. Crawford didn't see anything connecting Marsh to April's disappearance. No blood, no signs of struggle, no women's clothing or belongings that didn't belong. He thanked Marsh and moved on. Crawford interviewed Travis extensively, multiple times over the next several days. He asked about the relationship. Any fights? Any jealousy? Any violence? Travis admitted they'd had arguments, normal couple stuff, about where to spend holidays, about money, about the future, but nothing serious, never physical. He said he loved April, wanted to marry her. He showed Crawford the promise ring he'd planned to give her. He broke down crying.
Crawford asked Travis to take a polygraph. Travis agreed immediately. He passed. That didn't clear him entirely. Polygraphs aren't foolproof, but it was something. Crawford looked into Travis's background. No criminal record, no history of violence, no restraining orders. Co-workers and friends described him as a good guy, a little hot-headed sometimes, but not dangerous. Crawford kept Travis on the suspect list, but began looking elsewhere. Crawford interviewed April's co-workers at the Goodyear plant. Everyone loved April. No workplace conflicts. No inappropriate relationships. No one who gave her trouble. She was reliable, friendly,
professional. He interviewed her friends. Jessica, her best friend, was devastated. She said April had been happy lately, excited about her relationship with Travis, talking about going back to school, making plans. There was no indication April wanted to leave or start over somewhere new.
Crawford looked into April's finances. Her bank account had $412 in it. No large withdrawals, no suspicious activity. Her credit card had a small balance, recent charges for groceries, gas, the watch she'd bought Travis. Nothing unusual. He checked her phone records. April had made several calls in the days before her disappearance. To her mother, to Travis, to Jessica, to her brother. Normal stuff. No calls to crisis hotlines or shelters or anyone suspicious. Crawford organized searches. Volunteers from the community showed up by the hundreds. They walked every street in Gadsden, checked every wooded area, looked in abandoned buildings, searched along the Coosa River. Local businesses posted flyers with April's photo. "Have you seen this woman?" The media covered the story extensively. Local news ran segments every night. The Birmingham stations picked it up. April's photo was everywhere. Someone had to have seen something.
Tips started coming in. Dozens of them. Hundreds eventually. A woman thought she saw April at a gas station in Anniston. Turned out to be someone else. A man reported seeing a woman matching April's description getting into a car near her apartment the night she disappeared. Police followed up. The woman was identified, not April. Crawford chased every lead. Most went nowhere. It's frustrating work, exhausting. You get your hopes up with each new piece of information, only to have it crumble under scrutiny. He looked into sex offenders in the area. There were several. He interviewed each one, checked their alibis. Most were accounted for. A few couldn't provide alibis, but also had no connection to April, no evidence linking them to her disappearance. He considered the possibility of human trafficking. Young women sometimes vanished into that nightmare. But April didn't fit the typical profile. She wasn't a runaway, wasn't vulnerable in the usual ways, and trafficking victims usually disappeared from more public places, truck stops, bus stations, not from their locked apartments. Weeks passed. Then a month, then 2 months. The active search slowed down, not because police stopped caring, but because they'd exhausted immediate leads. Crawford still worked the case daily, but he was also being assigned new cases. Resources were finite. April's family never stopped searching. Linda made thousands of flyers. She drove to neighboring towns and plastered them everywhere. She called police departments across Alabama, asking them to check their Jane Does. She contacted hospitals, morgues, shelters. Robert hired a private investigator. The investigator didn't find anything new, but he kept the pressure on police, kept the case from being forgotten. Michael, April's brother, dropped out of college. He couldn't focus, couldn't function. His sister was missing, and the world expected him to go to class and study and pretend everything was normal. He spent his days searching, driving back roads, looking in ditches, hoping to find something, anything.
Travis was destroyed. He felt guilty even though logically he knew he'd done nothing wrong. He replayed that night over and over. What if he'd called earlier?
What if he'd insisted on picking her up? What if? What if? What if? He started drinking too much, lost his job, moved back in with his parents. The promise ring sat in a drawer, a constant reminder of the future that never happened. 6 months after April disappeared, Crawford got a break, or what seemed like a break. A hiker found women's clothing in a wooded area about 30 miles from Gadsden. Jeans, a red sweater, a denim jacket. The same clothes April had been wearing the night she vanished. Crawford rushed to the scene. The clothes were collected, sent to the lab. Tests showed the clothes had been there for months, exposed to rain and sun and wildlife. But there was no blood, no obvious signs of violence, no body nearby, despite extensive searching. The clothes were positively identified as April's. Travis recognized the jacket. He'd given it to her for Christmas. Linda recognized the sweater. She'd bought it for April's birthday. But what did it mean? Had April been taken to that location? Had she been killed there and her body moved? Or had someone dumped the clothes there to throw off the investigation? Crawford worked the new lead. He interviewed people who lived near where the clothes were found. Had anyone seen anything? Any strange vehicles? Any suspicious activity? No one had seen anything helpful.
He considered the location. It was remote, not many houses around, lots of trees. You could access it by car, but you'd have to know it was there. It wasn't visible from the main road. Someone familiar with the area would have known about it. Someone local. Crawford went back through his suspect list. Who would know about that location? Travis had done construction work in the area years ago. David Marsh, the neighbor, grew up in Gadsden and knew the backroads. Several of April's co-workers had family who lived near there. It didn't narrow things down much. DNA testing in 1992 wasn't what it is today. Crawford sent the clothes for testing anyway. Hair and fiber analysis, looking for anything foreign. Anything that might belong to the perpetrator. Results came back weeks later. There were fibers on the clothes that didn't match anything from April's apartment. Dark blue fibers, possibly from a carpet or upholstery. Could be from a vehicle. Could be from where she was held. Could be from anywhere. There were several hairs found on the sweater. Some were April's, some were unknown. But hair analysis without DNA wasn't precise. They could test for color, texture, race. That was about it. Crawford pushed forward. He re-interviewed Travis, asked about the location where the clothes were found. Travis admitted he'd been there before, years ago, for work, but he had no reason to be there recently, and he'd passed a polygraph. Crawford noted the information, but didn't have enough to make an arrest. He looked at David Marsh again. Something about Marsh bothered Crawford. He couldn't put his finger on it. Marsh had been cooperative, maybe too cooperative, always quick to answer questions, always had an explanation ready. Crawford did a deeper background check.
Marsh had grown up in Gadsden, worked various jobs over the years: warehouse work, delivery driver, factory work. No criminal record. Never married, lived alone, kept to himself mostly. Neighbors described him as quiet, a little odd maybe, but harmless. Crawford interviewed Marsh again, asked about his whereabouts the night April disappeared. Marsh repeated his story. He'd been home until 7:15. Then he went to work. His supervisor confirmed Marsh had clocked in at 8 that night. He'd worked until 6 the next morning. But Crawford noticed something. Marsh's apartment was maybe 20 feet from April's door. He would have heard if someone came and took April. He would have seen if she left on her own, unless he was involved. Crawford asked Marsh point blank, "Did you have anything to do with April Henderson's disappearance?" Marsh looked him in the eye and said no. "Absolutely not. I barely knew her. We'd say hi in passing, that's it." Crawford asked Marsh to take a polygraph. Marsh said he didn't think that was necessary. He had nothing to hide, but he'd heard polygraphs weren't reliable. He'd rather not. It was his right to refuse. Crawford couldn't force him.
That refusal bothered Crawford. Innocent people usually wanted to clear themselves, but refusal alone wasn't evidence of guilt. Some people just didn't trust the system, or didn't want to be involved, or were advised by lawyers to avoid polygraphs. Crawford couldn't arrest Marsh, couldn't even get a warrant to search his apartment again more thoroughly. He didn't have probable cause. Suspicion wasn't enough. He needed evidence, something concrete, something that would convince a judge and jury. The case continued. Crawford worked it when he could, but more time passed. 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. April Henderson became a cold case. Not forgotten, but not actively investigated either. Her file sat in a box with dozens of others, unsolved, waiting.
The years stretched on. 1993, 1994, 1995. April's face stared out from flyers that faded in shop windows. Her story was mentioned in the newspaper every year on the anniversary of her disappearance. But leads dried up. The phone stopped ringing with tips. Linda Henderson refused to give up. She couldn't. What mother could? Every morning she woke up thinking today might be the day. Today someone might remember something. Today April might be found. She kept April's room exactly as it had been. The twin bed with the flowered comforter, the posters on the walls, the stuffed animals April had collected as a child. Linda would sit in there sometimes, hours at a time, just being close to her daughter's things. She joined support groups for families of missing persons. There were more of them than you'd think. Parents, siblings, children, all living in this horrible limbo, not knowing, not grieving properly. Because how do you grieve someone who might still be alive? Robert tried to stay strong for Linda, but he was breaking inside. He threw himself into work, spent 14, 16 hours a day at his shop, fixing cars, changing oil, anything to keep his hands busy and his mind occupied. But at night, Alone with his thoughts, the pain was unbearable. Michael, April's brother, struggled the most. He'd been 19 when she vanished. Now he was in his 20s, trying to build a life while carrying this massive weight. He got a job at a warehouse, met a woman, got married, had kids. But April's absence was always there, a shadow over every happy moment. Travis tried to move on. He felt guilty about it, like he was betraying April. But what else could he do? Wait forever? He dated other women. None of the relationships lasted. He compared everyone to April, found them lacking. Eventually, he stopped trying, accepted that part of his life was over. Detective Crawford retired in 2001. He'd worked the police department for 34 years. He'd solved a lot of cases, but April Henderson haunted him. He'd failed her family. He thought about her often in retirement, wondered where she was, whether she'd suffered, whether her killer was still walking free. A new detective inherited Crawford's cold cases. His name was Marcus Washington. He was younger, ambitious. Fresh eyes sometimes saw things others missed. Washington reviewed April's file, thick with reports and interviews and dead ends. He noticed Crawford's notes about David Marsh, the neighbor who'd refused the polygraph. Washington decided to look into Marsh again, see what he'd been up to in the years since April disappeared. Marsh still lived in Gadsden, still worked warehouse jobs, still kept to himself. Washington drove by Marsh's current residence, a small house on the south side of town. Nothing remarkable, well-maintained, quiet street. Washington ran Marsh's name through the system again. Still no criminal record, no arrests, no restraining orders. On paper, Marsh was a model citizen. But Washington talked to Crawford, asked what his gut said about Marsh. Crawford admitted Marsh had always bothered him. Something off about the guy, too calm, too helpful. And that refusal to take a polygraph stuck in Crawford's mind. Washington wanted to interview Marsh again, but he needed a reason. He couldn't just knock on the door and start asking questions about a case from years ago without something new to justify it. Meanwhile, technology was advancing. DNA testing was becoming more sophisticated, more reliable. Washington sent April's clothes for retesting with the new methods. Maybe they'd find something the old tests missed. Results took months. But when they came back, there was news. The unknown hairs found on April's sweater had enough material for DNA testing. They ran it through CODIS, the FBI's DNA database. No matches. Whoever the hair belonged to wasn't in the system. But Washington now had a DNA profile. If he could get a suspect's DNA, he could compare them. The problem was getting suspects to voluntarily provide DNA, and he couldn't force them without probable cause. Years continued to pass. 2005, 2010, 2015. April had been gone for over 20 years. Linda was in her 60s now, still waiting, still hoping. Robert had health problems, heart issues. Stress had taken its toll. Michael had teenagers of his own. They asked about their Aunt April, the aunt they'd never met. The case was colder than ever. Washington had other cases, current cases. He couldn't spend all his time on a disappearance from 1992, but he didn't forget. He'd pull the file out occasionally, review it, look for something new. In 2018, genetic genealogy became a tool for law enforcement. You've probably heard about it. Police used public DNA databases to identify the Golden State Killer. Suddenly, cold cases were being solved left and right. Washington wondered if genetic genealogy could help with April's case. He had DNA from the hairs found on her clothes. Could he use that to identify whose hairs they were? He submitted the DNA profile to a genetic genealogy company, not directly, but through a lab that specialized in forensic genealogy. The process took time. They built a family tree based on the DNA matches, narrowed down possible relatives, then possible individuals.
In 2019, they got a name. The DNA from the hair found on April Henderson's sweater belonged to someone related to the Marsh family. Specifically, it could potentially belong to David Marsh. The odds were significant enough to warrant further investigation. Washington felt a surge of excitement. Crawford had been right all along. Something about Marsh was off. But Washington still needed more. He needed Marsh's DNA to confirm. He needed evidence beyond a single hair that could be explained away. Washington began surveilling Marsh, discreetly, legally. He watched Marsh's routines, where he worked, where he shopped, where he ate, waiting for an opportunity to obtain Marsh's DNA without a warrant. In 2020, Washington got his chance. Marsh ate lunch at a local diner, left a water glass and coffee cup on the table. After Marsh left, Washington entered the diner, explained to the manager what he needed. The manager was cooperative, bagged the glass and cup as evidence. Washington sent the items to the lab. Weeks passed. Then he got the call. The DNA from the cup matched the DNA from the hair found on April Henderson's sweater. David Marsh's DNA was on her clothes. Washington now had probable cause, but he wanted more. He wanted to know why Marsh's DNA was on April's clothes. He wanted a confession. He wanted justice.
Detective Marcus Washington sat in his office staring at the lab results. After 28 years, he finally had something solid. David Marsh's DNA on April Henderson's sweater. It was enough for an arrest. But Washington wanted to be strategic. He wanted to maximize his chances of getting a confession. He consulted with the district attorney. They agreed on a plan. They'd bring Marsh in for questioning, present him with the evidence, see if he'd talk. If he lawyered up immediately, so be it. They'd proceed. Had enough for an arrest, but if he talked, they might get answers. Closure for the Henderson family. On March 3, 2021, Washington and 2 other officers drove to Marsh's house. It was early morning, 6:30. They wanted to catch Marsh before work, before he had time to think or prepare. Washington knocked on the door. Marsh answered in sweatpants and a t-shirt. He looked older now, 59 years old, gray hair, deep lines on his face. But his eyes were the same,
sharp, alert. Washington identified himself, said they needed Marsh to come down to the station, answer some questions about an old case. Marsh asked, which case? Washington said, the April Henderson case. Marsh's face didn't change. He said he'd told the previous detective everything he knew years ago. Washington said new evidence had come to light. They needed to go over it. Marsh asked if he was under arrest. Washington said not yet, but they really needed him to come talk to them. Marsh could have refused, could have demanded a lawyer. Instead, he said, fine, let me get dressed.
That was interesting. Guilty people usually lawyer up immediately. Innocent people sometimes do too, but Marsh's willingness to talk suggested either innocence or overconfidence. Washington hoped it was the latter. They drove to the station. Marsh sat in the back of the patrol car, silent, staring out the window. Washington watched him in the rear-view mirror. Marsh's expression was blank, unreadable. At the station, they put Marsh in an interview room. Small, white walls, metal table, 2 chairs, a camera recording everything. Washington let Marsh sit there for 20 minutes. Let him sweat a little, a common tactic. Then Washington entered with another detective, Officer Lisa Chen. They sat across from Marsh. Washington read him his Miranda rights, explained he wasn't under arrest yet, but he had the right to stay silent, the right to an attorney. Did he understand? Marsh said he understood, said he didn't need a lawyer because he had nothing to hide. He'd told them everything 28 years ago. He barely knew April Henderson. Washington opened a folder, pulled out a photo of April. Young, smiling, beautiful. He slid it across the table to Marsh, asked him to look at it. Marsh glanced at the photo, said yes, that was the woman who disappeared from his building.
Washington asked Marsh to tell him again about the night April disappeared. Marsh repeated the same story he'd told Crawford. He'd been home until 7:15, hadn't seen April that day, left for work around 7:15, clocked in at 8, worked until 6 in the morning. Washington nodded, asked if Marsh had ever been inside April's apartment. Marsh said no, never. They weren't friends, just neighbors who occasionally said hello. Washington pulled out another document, the DNA report. He slid it across the table, explained that investigators had found hair on April's clothing, hair that had been tested, hair that belonged to David Marsh. Marsh stared at the document. For the first time, his expression changed. Surprise, or maybe fear. He said that didn't make sense. How could his hair be on her clothes if he'd never been in her apartment? Washington said that was an excellent question. Maybe Marsh wanted to explain it. Marsh said he couldn't explain it. Maybe the lab made a mistake. Maybe it wasn't his hair. Washington said the lab didn't make mistakes. The DNA was a match. 99.99% certainty. Marsh was quiet for a long moment. Washington let the silence stretch. Sometimes silence was more effective than questions. People felt compelled to fill it, to explain, to defend. Finally, Marsh spoke. He said maybe his hair got on her clothes in the hallway. They lived next door to each other. Maybe they brushed past each other. Maybe his hair transferred that way. Washington said that was possible, unlikely, but possible. But there was another piece of evidence. The clothes had been found 30 miles away in a wooded area. How did Marsh explain that? Marsh said he couldn't explain it. He didn't know anything about that. Washington asked if Marsh knew where the clothes had been found. Did he know the area? Marsh hesitated, then admitted he'd been to that area before, years ago, went fishing there sometimes. Washington leaned forward, said it was interesting that Marsh's DNA was on clothes found in an area Marsh was familiar with. Marsh said lots of people knew that area. It didn't mean anything. Washington said it meant something to him. Officer Chen spoke up, asked Marsh why he'd refused to take a polygraph back in 1992. Marsh said he didn't trust polygraphs, heard they weren't accurate. Chen said innocent people usually wanted to clear their names. Marsh said he didn't have to prove his innocence. That's not how the system worked. Washington changed tactics, started talking about April, what a good person she was, how much her family loved her, how they'd spent 28 years not knowing what happened to her, how they deserved answers.
He asked Marsh if he had any sympathy for the Henderson family. Marsh said of course he did. It was terrible what happened. Washington said Marsh could help them, could finally give them closure. Marsh said he didn't know anything. Washington pushed harder, said they knew Marsh was involved. The DNA proved it. Said Marsh had two choices. He could tell them what happened and show remorse, or he could stay silent and let a jury decide his fate. Which would look better, cooperation or obstruction? Marsh asked if he was under arrest. Washington said not yet, but they had enough evidence to arrest him. They were giving him a chance to tell his side of the story. Marsh said maybe he should talk to a lawyer first. Washington said that was his right, but once a lawyer got involved, the offer for cooperation went away. Marsh was quiet again. Washington could see him thinking, calculating, weighing his options. Then Marsh did something unexpected. He started crying. Not loud sobbing, just tears running down his face. He put his head in his hands. Washington and Chen exchanged glances. This was the moment, the break. Washington softly said it was okay. Take your time. We're listening. Marsh looked up. His eyes were red. He said he'd carried this for 28 years. Every day. The guilt, the fear. He'd never meant for it to happen. It was an accident. Washington gently asked what was an accident. And then David Marsh confessed.
David Marsh's confession took 3 hours. He talked slowly, crying at times, other times detached, like he was describing something that had happened to someone else. Washington and Chen listened, recorded every word, let him talk. Marsh started by saying he'd been obsessed with April Henderson. He'd lived next door to her for 8 months. From the day she moved in, he'd been drawn to her. Her smile, her laugh, the way she was always so friendly to everyone. He would listen through the wall, hear her moving around her apartment, hear her talking on the phone, hear her music. He'd watch for her coming and going, time his own comings and goings to coincide with hers so he could see her in the hallway. He knew it was wrong, knew it was creepy, but he couldn't help himself. He'd never been good with women, never had a girlfriend, never been on a date. At 40 years old, he was lonely, desperate for connection, and April was kind to him. She'd smile, say hello, ask how he was doing. He convinced himself she liked him too, that her friendliness meant something more. He started fantasizing about a relationship with her, about asking her out, about her saying yes.
On Valentine's Day, 1992, Marsh made a decision. He was going to tell April how he felt. It was Valentine's Day, the perfect time. Maybe she'd be receptive. Maybe she felt the same way. He heard her come home around 6, heard her moving around her apartment. He waited until 7, wanted to give her time to settle in. Then he went to her door and knocked. April answered. She was wearing a robe. Her hair was wet. She'd just gotten out of the shower. She seemed surprised to see him, asked if everything was okay. Marsh said yes. He just wanted to talk to her about something. April hesitated. Marsh could see she was uncomfortable, but she was too polite to just close the door in his face. She said she was actually getting ready to go out. Could they talk another time? Marsh said it would only take a minute. April reluctantly stepped back and let him in, left the door open, stood near it, body language saying she wanted this to be quick. Marsh walked into her living room, looked around. This was the first time he'd been inside her apartment. He told her he'd been wanting to talk to her for a while, that he really liked her, that they thought they could be good together. April's face changed. She looked uncomfortable. She said that was sweet, but she had a boyfriend. She was happy with Travis. She hoped they could still be friendly neighbors. Marsh felt something inside him break. All those months of fantasizing, all those hopes, shattered in seconds. He felt humiliated, angry, rejected. He said something. He couldn't remember exactly what. Something about how she'd led him on, how she'd been flirting with him. April looked confused, said she'd just been friendly. She hadn't meant to lead him on.
An argument started. Voices raised. April told him he needed to leave. Marsh said not until they finished talking. April moved toward the door to usher him out. Marsh grabbed her arm, not hard, just to get her attention, to make her listen. April pulled away, told him not to touch her, told him to leave now or she'd scream. Marsh panicked. He didn't want her to scream, didn't want the neighbors to hear, didn't want the police called. He put his hand over her mouth, just to keep her quiet, just for a second. April struggled, fought back. She was small, but strong, terrified. Marsh was trying to calm her down, trying to tell her he wasn't going to hurt her. But she couldn't hear him, couldn't hear anything over her own panic. They stumbled backward. April's back hit the coffee table. They fell. Marsh's hand was still over her mouth. April was trying to breathe,
trying to fight him off. Marsh said he was squeezing too hard. Didn't mean to, just didn't want her to scream. And then April stopped struggling, went limp. Marsh pulled his hand away, looked at her. Her eyes were open, but empty, not breathing. He shook her, said her name. No response. He checked for a pulse. Nothing. April Henderson was dead. Marsh sat on the floor next to her body. Shock, disbelief, terror. This wasn't supposed to happen. He just wanted to talk to her, just wanted a chance. Now she was dead, and he'd killed her. He didn't know how long he sat there. Maybe minutes, maybe an hour. Time stopped having meaning. Finally, survival instinct kicked in. He had to do something, had to hide what he'd done. If anyone found out, his life was over. He looked around the apartment, thought about what to do. He couldn't leave her there, couldn't call the police, couldn't undo what had happened. He had to make her disappear.
Marsh went back to his apartment, got garbage bags and duct tape, came back to April's apartment. He wrapped her body, carefully, methodically, trying not to think about what he was doing, who this was. He noticed April's clothes, the red sweater, the jeans. They'd gotten twisted during the struggle. He decided to change her, put her in different clothes. He didn't know why. Maybe it made it less real somehow. He found sweatpants and a t-shirt in her dresser, changed her, put her original clothes in a separate bag. He waited until after midnight, until the building was quiet, until he was sure no one would see him. Then he carried April's body down the back stairs, put her in his truck, covered her with a tarp. He drove, no destination in mind at first, just away, away from the city, away from people. He ended up at the wooded area where he used to fish, remote, secluded. He knew it well. He buried her there, dug a shallow grave with a shovel he had in his truck, laid her body in it, covered her up, said he was sorry, so sorry, stood there in the dark, crying, then drove home. The next morning, police were everywhere. April was missing. Marsh acted concerned, answered their questions, pretended he knew nothing. And he got away with it. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. No one suspected him. But guilt ate at him, every day, every night. He couldn't sleep without seeing April's face, couldn't close his eyes without reliving those moments. He thought about confessing, about turning himself in, but cowardice won. Self-preservation. He stayed silent. A few months later, he went back to where he'd buried her. Something compelled him. Maybe guilt, maybe fear someone would find her. He dug her up. The body had decomposed. It was horrible. But he moved her, buried her somewhere else, deeper, in a location he knew no one would ever find. But he kept her clothes, the original clothes, the red sweater and jeans and jacket. He didn't know why. Maybe part of him wanted to be caught,
wanted to be punished. He drove around with them in his truck for weeks. Finally, he dumped them in the woods. Different woods. Away from where he'd buried her. Stupid. Reckless. But he wasn't thinking clearly. And then the clothes were found. Police came asking questions. Marsh was terrified, but they couldn't connect him. Not definitively. He'd been careful. Worn gloves when he buried her. Cleaned everything. There was no physical evidence in his apartment.
Years passed. The guilt never faded. He thought about April every single day. Thought about her family, her mother who'd never stop looking. He wanted to tell them where she was, wanted to give them that peace, but he couldn't, because telling them meant prison, meant his life ending, until today. Until Detective Washington put that DNA report in front of him, and Marsh realized it was over. 28 years of running from the truth. 28 years of carrying this weight. It was finally over. Washington asked the critical question. Where is April Henderson's body? Where did you bury her the second time? Marsh gave specific directions. A wooded area off County Road 47, about 40 miles from Gadsden, near an old abandoned hunting cabin. 300 yards northeast of the cabin, under a large oak tree with a split trunk. You couldn't miss it. Washington sent officers immediately. Forensic teams, cadaver dogs. They searched the area Marsh described, found the oak tree, started digging. 8 feet down, they found remains. Human remains, skeletal, but identifiable through dental records. April Marie Henderson had been found.
David Marsh was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. Not first-degree, because the prosecution believed his story that he hadn't planned to kill April, that it happened during a struggle, that he'd panicked. Still, second-degree murder in Alabama carried a sentence of 20 years to life. Marsh's arraignment was brief. He pleaded not guilty on advice of his public defender. The defender knew the case was unwinnable, but had to try. Marsh's confession was recorded. The DNA evidence was solid. April's body had been found exactly where Marsh said it would be. There was no defense. The trial began in September 2021. The courtroom was packed. April's family sat in the front row. Linda, now 70 years old. Robert, 72, in failing health. Michael, now 48, with his wife and kids. Travis, who never married, looking older than his years. Friends, community members, people who'd never met April, but had followed her case for decades. The prosecution presented their case methodically. DNA evidence, the confession, the recovery of April's remains, forensic testimony about cause of death, asphyxiation, pressure to the nose and mouth preventing breathing, consistent with Marsh's account. They played the confession tape, 3 hours condensed to the key moments. The courtroom listened in absolute silence. Linda Henderson sobbed. Robert held her hand, tears streaming down his own face, hearing exactly what happened to their daughter, how she'd spent her last moments terrified and fighting for her life. The prosecution brought witnesses. Mrs. Patterson, now in her 80s, testified about seeing April come home that night. Testified about Marsh living next door. April's friends testified about her character, her kindness, her excitement about her future, her love for her family. They painted a picture of a life full of potential, a life stolen. The defense had little to work with. They argued Marsh hadn't intended to kill April, that he'd made a terrible mistake in a moment of panic, that he'd lived with guilt for nearly 30 years, that he'd finally done the right thing by confessing. They called a psychologist who testified about Marsh's social isolation, his inability to form relationships, his fantasy life. Not excuses, the psychologist said, but context, understanding. Marsh was mentally ill, not psychotic, not insane, but damaged, lonely, desperate.
The defense asked for mercy, for the minimum sentence, for recognition that Marsh had cooperated, had led them to April's body, had given the family closure they'd sought for 28 years. The prosecution countered, argued that Marsh had only confessed when caught, that he'd had 28 years to do the right thing and hadn't, that he'd let April's family suffer, let them wonder, let them hope she might still be alive somewhere. That level of cruelty deserved no mercy. April's family was allowed to give victim impact statements. Linda went first. She spoke directly to Marsh, told him about the 28 years she'd waited. Every birthday she celebrated knowing April wasn't there. Every Christmas. Every Mother's Day. Every ordinary Tuesday. She told him about April's room that she'd kept exactly the same, about driving past the apartment building where April had lived, about calling April's old phone number sometimes just to hear it ring, about the private investigator who'd taken their money and found nothing, about the false hope every time the phone rang. She told him about Robert's heart attacks, 2 of them, stress-induced, about Michael's struggles with depression and anxiety, about how Marsh hadn't just killed April, he'd destroyed their entire family, stolen decades of their lives, robbed them of peace. Robert spoke next, briefer. He said he'd dreamed for 28 years about confronting April's killer, about what he'd say, what he'd do. Now that moment was here, and he had no words adequate for his rage and pain. He said he hoped Marsh lived a very long time, in prison, suffering, the way the Henderson family had suffered. Michael spoke last. He talked about growing up without his sister, about his kids who would never meet their aunt, about the hole April's absence left in his life, about anniversaries and milestones marked by her absence. He said nothing Marsh endured would ever equal what he'd taken from them. Travis didn't give a statement. He'd submitted a written one that was read aloud. He wrote about the life he and April should have had, the marriage, the kids, the future, about the promise ring he still kept in a drawer, about how he'd never fully moved on, because how could you move on from someone who just vanished? The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, found David Marsh guilty of second-degree murder. Alabama law allowed for sentencing by the judge. The judge considered everything: Marsh's confession, his cooperation,
his lack of prior criminal history, but also the heinousness of the crime, the decades of deception, the suffering of the Henderson family.
The judge sentenced David Marsh to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Marsh showed no emotion, just stood there as bailiffs handcuffed him and led him away. He'd be 70 years old. He'd die in prison. The Henderson family nodded in satisfaction. It wasn't enough. Nothing would ever be enough, but it was something. April's remains were released to her family. They held a funeral, finally, 29 years after she disappeared. Hundreds of people attended. The church overflowed. People stood outside. April was eulogized, remembered, mourned properly at last. She was buried in Forest Cemetery in Gadsden. Her headstone read, April Marie Henderson, beloved daughter, sister, and friend. Taken too soon, but never forgotten. 1968 to 1992. Finally at peace. David Marsh is currently incarcerated at Donaldson Correctional Facility in Bessemer, Alabama. He's 61 years old. He'll die there. He's expressed remorse in letters to the Henderson family. They've never responded. Never will. Some things are unforgivable.
April Henderson's case haunts everyone who's touched it. Detective Crawford, now in his 80s, attended the trial. He said finally solving the case brought closure, but no joy. April was still dead. The Henderson family still suffered. Justice came 3 decades too late. Detective Washington continues to work cold cases. He says April's case taught him to trust his instincts, to never give up, to remember that behind every file, every case number is a real person, a family waiting for answers. The Henderson family tries to move forward. Linda and Robert are in their 70s now. Their health isn't great, but they have peace knowing what happened, knowing April has a proper burial place they can visit, knowing her killer will die in prison. Michael works with families of missing persons now, volunteers his time helping them navigate the system, offering support, sharing what he learned, turning his pain into purpose. Travis finally moved on, met someone, got married a few years after the trial. He says he'll always love April, always wonder what might have been, but he's allowed himself to live again, to be happy. He thinks April would want that. This case illustrates several important truths about crime and investigation. First, DNA technology has revolutionized cold case work. Evidence that meant little in 1992 solved the case in 2021. Families of missing persons should never give up hope that new technology might bring answers. Second, killers often hide in plain sight. David Marsh wasn't a stranger who broke into April's apartment. He was her neighbor, someone she saw regularly, someone who seemed harmless. The statistics bear this out. Most murder victims know their killers. Trust is weaponized against them. Third, guilt is a powerful force. Marsh could have stayed silent, could have taken his secret to the grave, but guilt ate at him for 28 years.
When confronted with evidence, he confessed. Not all killers do, but the weight of what they've done breaks them eventually. Finally, the importance of never giving up. The Henderson family never stopped searching, never stopped asking questions, never let April's case be forgotten. Detective Crawford never forgot. Detective Washington picked up where Crawford left off. Persistence matters. Justice delayed is painful, but justice achieved brings some measure of peace. April Henderson was 23 years old when she died. She should have lived another 60 years, should have married Travis, should have had children, should have become a teacher, should have seen her snow globes collect dust, should have sung terrible country music with her windows down, should have lived. Instead, she got 8 minutes, 8 terrifying minutes on Valentine's Day, 1992, fighting for her life against a man who claimed to care about her, dying on her living room floor, buried in an unmarked grave for 29 years.
But April is more than how she died. She was a daughter who called her mother every day, a sister who teased her brother, a girlfriend who bought thoughtful gifts, a co-worker who remembered birthdays, a volunteer who helped kids learn to read, a friend who showed up with ice cream and stayed until dawn. She was real. She mattered. She's remembered. If you're listening to this and you have information about any unsolved case, please contact the police. Someone, somewhere is waiting for answers. Someone, somewhere needs closure. Your information, no matter how small it seems, might be the piece that solves the puzzle. If you're a family member of a missing person, don't give up. Keep telling their story. Keep their name alive. Keep pushing investigators. Technology advances. People's consciences break. Cases get solved, even after 30 years. And if you're struggling with obsession or unhealthy attachments to people who don't return your feelings, please get help. Talk to someone. See a therapist. Rejection is painful, but it's not the end. Violence is never the answer. Nothing justifies taking another person's life. April Marie Henderson. Remember her name. Not as a victim, but as a person. A woman who loved and was loved. Who had dreams and hopes and a future. Who was stolen from this world far too soon. Rest in peace, April. Your family finally brought you home.